this episode of Influence and Impact, we are diving into the nitty-gritty, like the true origin stories of hot rodding. We've been kind of laying the foundation for it with all the land speed stuff and the racing stuff. This is where hot rod, the term, kind of comes about, and the industry really is born after World War II.
You're exactly right. I mean, we're going to be talking about names that we hear about even today. These are 70 years ago, right? So names like Alex Xydias, Vic Edelbrock,
At Iskandarian, Isky cams.
Right.
You know, a lot of these guys were the foundation of what started SEMA, but a lot of them were younger guys that, were either in LA. Some of them, like Alex Xydias, some of those guys were born here in LA.
Right.
Some of them were born either in farm country, either in California or the Midwest, and a lot of them got drafted, obviously, into World War II. There's kind of the classic story we've all heard of these guys having that adrenaline rush, wanting to go fast. They're used to either airplanes or, going off-roading in a Jeep, and they learned how to fix them up. They learned how to work on them and maintain them in either the Army or the Air Force or something like that.
Right.
So they had skills for machining. They had skills for engineering, for, mechanical work that they had to find a way to transfer that back when when the war was over.
Right. And the good thing about the war is that it made technology come to the main place.
Well, a lot of the technology, especially of that time and even still now, was
Right.
developed during that time.
Yeah.
And what's interesting, maybe to kind of kick this off as a good, connection with that, we talked about land speed on the last few episodes. Belly tanks became a thing. Those are actually just fuel tanks from
planes. They're
planes.
They're drop tanks. Yeah.
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 But they were just teardrop shaped, and so like. Just an example, Bill Burke was the first guy to run one of those. He did a P-51 Mustang belly tank. Mm-hmm. Doesn't look exactly like the quintessential sleek belly tank.
Right.
He ended up using a different, when he made more of them, they used a different airplanes tanker and stuff. Yeah. And I think, Model T, like kind of frame, kind of half shortened and put together, run it through, and that was basically just a skin, if you will, for.
Well, you just described Alex Xydias' SoCal Speed Special is what you just described, which was built by Bill Burke.
Yeah.
Okay, and he originally built.
So the first one he did was from a P-51, and then
he ended up
building more of them.
But Bill built like a dozen of them or so the first time.
He built a lot of them.
Yeah, I mean, his idea, he saw obviously, them unloading the tanks and stuff like that in the South Pacific, so that was something to him. He's like, okay, I can use that as a race car.
Yeah.
But he got home and he figured out that the Model T was a lot cheaper and also dimensional wise kind of fit that belly tank.
Yeah.
And so they went ahead and made, like, kind of at the time, the perfect surplus. And I say surplus because they got those things for damn near nothing.
And that's the thing. Same with a lot of the other parts and stuff. They could get them easily because, hey, war was over.
Yeah.
I mean, even in general, the military, the government was shrinking down or cutting a lot of programs.
Right.
Let's get into some definitions of some of these, because we are going to be throwing out some stuff that people are familiar with.
Right.
But they have a bit of an origin story. Like we said, the belly tanker was the belly of the aircraft. It was the fuel tank.
Right.
And maybe because you also had to, like, basically be on your belly
to
go down it.
No, I mean, it meant, like, the underside of an airplane is usually referred to as the belly. And these belly tanks, or what they call drop tanks, would carry extra fuel. And sure enough, as they would fly and they were out of fuel, they would drop the tanks. So they were disposable tanks.
Yeah.
Right. So they weren't really meant to be put together except for to hold fuel.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, they weren't like, hey, this thing's going to last.
And that's the thing, too. I mean, you think of they're going long range bombing runs or whatever they're doing.
Right.
You're expending, you want as much fuel as you can, but then once that fuel's gone, you want to get rid of that as much weight as you can. Otherwise, you might not make it back.
The other thing, the reason why these things were really invented is that the P-51s or the pursuit planes, P-40s, that kind of stuff, which, later on were called fighters. Mm-hmm. The pursuit planes would have to escort the bombers into long distance ranges. So what would happen is these guys with the hopped up planes, they had to fly them far, and they would run out of gas before the big old tankers would, or the B-17s would run out of gas. So they had to have those fly in, they'd drop their tanks, and they were still able to have enough fuel to get back.
Yeah, and they were a little bit lighter weight, so they could all work out.
Right.
So we mentioned you mentioned hopped up. Mm-hmm. I mean, that does come from horse racing.
Horse racing, right?
Basically, you're giving you're drugging the horse to perform
little
steroid
Mark
McGuire,
enhancement.
Barry Bonds, action with it.
Right.
But that kind of transferred over to a lot of the earlier terms for increasing the horsepower of an engine. Gow jobs was kind of a term we mentioned before that was more or less like stripping off the roof, stripping off the fenders, the running boards, just making them as light as possible.
Souped up.
Souped up was another one.
Kind of where you threw a bunch of parts together to make your recipe, make your combination. That was your soup.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so Isky actually has Ed Iskandarian, Isky Cams. He has a quote kind of basically saying hop ups, soup ups, gow jobs. That's what we called them. We didn't have the name hot rod yet.
That's correct.
And there's no real consensus on where the term hot rod came from. Some people said it came from like hot as in like stolen car, and then rod maybe from the crankshaft or from some of the engine parts being replaced.
Right.
Probably the more that I've seen is from like the actual term hop up.
Right.
So it says like hot up, and then like it just evolved. And then maybe the rod came from Roadster. Like I said, there's multiple different versions.
Or maybe a guy just windowed a block and it was a real hot run. So he's like, man, that's a real hot rod.
Yeah. No, and but that became the term, but it's now the accepted term. It's the accoladed term.
Yes.
But a lot of the guys at the time, they tried to stay away from the term hot rod.
Right. It was derogatory, right?
It was, because that's what, like you got to remember what we talked about with the land speed stuff. There was these younger guys that were taking out the older cars that were, in a little bit more of a supply, back in the day.
Sure.
And it was easy to work with. They were taking them out to the dry lakes. They were running them around and doing organized racing. Well, after the war, obviously that from Southern California, all of that culture and that stuff spread. You probably had a buddy that you were stationed with and in the same foxhole with, talking about his car that he had back home.
Right.
So then you want to get into it.
Yeah.
And so on. So it really exploded. And obviously there was a lot of the younger guys and the teenagers that were hot rodding around town, street racing, doing this stuff. So a lot of the newspapers and the media, like we see with takeovers and stuff today,
right.
like
Nothing's
we saw
changed
with street racing and import cars and, after Fast and Furious, like there's always generations of street racing and hot rodding, and it seemed like the media really attached themselves to that term to describe these guys. And so like there's actually a quote from Wally Parks, who we'll talk a little bit about in this episode, probably a little bit later, as he was the founder of NHRA, Safety Safari before that. He was one of the early editors of Hot Rod Magazine.
And also on the board of the SCTA.
And he was on the board of the SCTA even before all of this, before the war.
Right.
But he had a quote in 1947 in the SCTA newsletter. It says, "We're not hot rods." So this is the guy that started the National Hot Rod National Hot Rod Association.
Yeah.
We are not hot rods. Members of the SCTA have long resolved to discourage the use of the name hot rod. To the general public, anything minus fenders, appearing loud and flashy, even the old man sedan, if it's driven by a teenager, it's classified as a hot rod.
Right.
Much unfavorable publicity has been reflected upon us due to the antics of irresponsible youngsters and some olders that like to make it like Indy.
Ooh, you kids.
Yeah, on the public streets. So, and he's saying, our problem's not controlling our members. They're good.
Oh.
He didn't say that, but basically
oh
no, our members are perfectly
we're
upstanding citizens.
Right.
It's distinguishing ourselves and our cars from the hot rodders.
Right.
We're running sports cars. But he didn't start the National Sports Car Association.
That's right.
But there was a lot of the influence from the European sports car racing as well, because a lot of guys stationed in England, in France, and were exposed to that stuff as well.
Well, it's even too. But take a second here too. At that time, the faster cars came from Europe. They came from Italy. They came from American V8 cars. They were not.
The V8 cars were the large family sedans.
Right. And this is even prior to that. I mean, we're talking like Deuces with a V8 flathead in it.
Just because it was so big.
Well, the
yeah,
engine.
You had to.
Yeah, yeah. So that's kind of the other thing that we look at is that those guys that were over there during the war, when they saw Alfa Romeos and they saw Ferraris and they saw, even MGs and Sunbeams, those guys were breaking the records. Yeah. It wasn't, the Ford or the Chevy or any of us American guys. So it was a little different, but they saw what those guys could do. So of course, when they brought it back over here, the technology, it poured over.
Yeah. And there's a lot of customizing stuff that went into it as well. There's some terms that definitely everyone's heard of, that more or less a lot of them got their start in the racing application, the function application of, these hot rods.
Right.
So chopped.
Yeah.
Chopping the roof of a car, chopping the top. Basically especially like a Model A Roadster, you can do the windshield
off, right?
But for some of these coupes and stuff like that,
right?
You had just a very tall, boxy brick on top of a car. So lower the profile of the roof, increase the aerodynamics. It also looks really cool.
Yeah.
Same thing with sectioning the body, channeling it where you're lowering it over the frame rails versus a high boy where it's
taller and
you can see fenderless and the frame rails are exposed.
Right.
You drop the axle down, so you had a dropped axle. Heat it up, bend the center of it. Even they would do like bobbed frames to basically where just as soon as the guy sitting in the car, that was it. Yeah, that was it. Right. That was the rear end.
Yeah.
Obviously we talked about Roadster, and then there's also like lake pipes, zoomies. A lot of that stuff was kind of the combination of the military plane, styling, mixed with what made sense to run out at the dry lake beds.
Exactly. Right.
So that's kind of like some of the basic stuff. But one of the popular things too is about the wheels. They were running, a lot of these guys were running 1935 spoke wheels.
Right.
So the wire spokes, but then of course later on, as engines got more powerful, they couldn't handle the torque. So that's when kind of the mag wheel kind of started out.
The reverse chrome steel solids is what they refer to as. And Bolton Tire and Wheel in Gardena, California was the first guy to do that for, I can't think of his name right now. Oh my God, it's really bad. Anson Automotive.
Yes, but Anson,
Lou Center.
Lou Center.
So he was the first guy to really kind of like tout those and make that a big deal.
Yeah.
Also, Alex Xydias, when he opened up SoCal Speed Shop, that was one of his first things that he sold were chrome lug nuts and chrome wheels.
If you still got the factory speakers in your truck, what are you doing? You need to get over to powerbaseusa.com. So if you use the code AUTOREV at powerbaseusa.com, you can get 10% off anything on the site. And even some of their portable audio systems like this little boombox here, the BT500. So Powerbase came out with this really cool under-the-seat subwoofer enclosure, and it's already amplified, it's under 3 inches tall, and it's about the size of a piece of paper. So it's perfect to put in a newer vehicle, a leased truck where you can't make any modifications. It's a simple setup to add a little extra bass to your system. And if you use the code AUTOREV at powerbaseusa.com right now, you can get 10% off on it. So go check it out. So if you've been following us on Auto Revolution and checked out some of our OBS Clash build series or even the documentary we did a few years ago, you know we do a lot of stuff with Beltec suspension. What's really cool is they partner with us to give you guys free shipping on every order that you use the code AUTOREVOLUTION at beltec.com. Once again, you can get free shipping on everything from OBS lowering kits to Jeep and brand new lift kits. Sway bars, shocks, you name it, you can get it at beltec.com. Use the code AUTOREVOLUTION at beltec.com to get free shipping. Now back to the show. And that's, because the wire spoke wheels,
they just
couldn't handle point, they couldn't handle it.
Right.
So maybe that'd be good to let's jump into some of these key people that were involved. And let's start with Alex Xydias, because you mentioned him. There's tons of these names. We mentioned, Bill Burke. We mentioned a lot of these guys. We even mentioned in the last episode about, Carl and Vita Orr.
Right.
Vita Orr kept the SCTA newsletter going while, everyone else was off
and war
overseas.
Right. Yeah.
But Alex Xydias was definitely, has been throughout his years, a big proponent of the hot rod world.
I think he's really the glue that kept us together, type thing, because if you really look at him after he gets home from the war, that's when things really start to kind of, you hear all these fancy names that really kind of build off of what he was doing.
Yeah.
So pretty much prior to the war, he was just a fan. He grew up in Hollywood. Mm-hmm. His dad, I think, was even he was a producer, a movie producer.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, said movie producer, and his mom was a fortune teller. So
yeah, right. Yeah, Madam X.
Nice.
Yes,
Hollywood couple.
She was Madam X from Hollywood. But the two of them had split. I know that because Alex lived with his mom, and of course, when he was working, right, he went to Fairfax High School with like Mickey Rooney and Judy Garland and those kind of guys.
But all the Hollywood stars.
Was really interesting when he went to junior high school. He had to walk past Vic Edelbrock's garage.
Yeah.
And so he would like peek in and he would see the midgets out front and that kind of stuff. So like he kind of knew like that's what I want to do, just at a younger age. So going to war, obviously what kept him informed was the SCTA newsletter.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something that he would dream about, like, hey, when I get home, I'm going to open up my own speed shop. And of course, seeing what the Orrs had done, over there in Culver City, when he got home, the day he got home from the war, he borrowed $100 from his mom and opened SoCal Speed Shop. The day he got home. Like, it's crazy.
No, he'd been planning it out, clearly. But no, and that's, we mentioned some of the, you mentioned some of the midget cars. That was a very popular thing for the, as far as racing was concerned. Like, midget car racing was huge,
right? Obviously
before the war, but really exploded after the war. But from we've seen, a lot of people kind of just they were over it.
Well, yeah, because they wore it out, is what happened.
Yeah. And it was a little bit of a gimmicky kind of a thing because it's a midget car.
And also too, you got to think where it was at. Southern California, Hollywood.
Yeah.
Right. So they wanted people just to fill these stadiums. Well, the problem was they had like 6 or 7 stadiums in like a 10-mile radius.
Yeah.
So you had Gilmore, that was right pretty much where CBS Television City is now, is where Gilmore Stadium was. So that's right in the middle of central West Los Angeles.
Yeah.
Right. So anybody could drive over to watch that race. But the problem was you could also go down the street to Culver City Stadium, or you could go to one of the 2 Ascots that were in LA. So it got kind of weird. Like, hey, where are you running tonight? Oh, I'm running over here. So it was unorganized. Too many people were doing it and people got sick of it.
Yeah.
So, and midget racing too was usually 4-cylinder Offenhausers that just dominated the class.
Yeah.
So some of those things, they didn't have a 4-cylinder Offenhauser street engine. So it didn't relate. You had these cars that
there was nothing you could really go do yourself,
yeah,
unless you had a midget car and you were midget car racing. Yeah.
Also, when you left the midget race, you didn't go to get into a midget car and go home.
Yeah.
You went and got in your Gow job or your
right? Your Roadster or something,
or
even your your 36. Or something. Yeah.
So that's kind of why that. But let's go back to Alex, because Alex, he opens up SoCal Speed Shop, and when he gets back from the war, obviously he starts selling kind of small trinkets and stuff like that. We know that Bill Burr came by, and Bill Burke came by.
Not the comedian.
or
although Bill Burr is into cars.
That's true.
He's a Ford truck guy.
That's true. Yeah. But no, so he of course was selling kind of smaller items. He wasn't the Orr Speed Shop at the time, or Bell Automotive that was over across town.
Yeah.
So he was really just selling small stuff, but he had all of the news. Like, people would come by, and plus 2, he was also part of the SCTA. So people knew who he was. They knew they was selling speed parts. He was in Burbank, which at the time wasn't really an area that had a lot of speed parts either. Mostly West Los Angeles, Culver City, and those areas were kind of the area where all the speed shops were at, because again, too, they were closer to the stadiums, right?
True.
So, and Vic Edelbrock too was over there kind of in that side of town too as well. So most of that, like, he was over the hill is what I'm saying. Alex Xydias was basically over the hill in the valley.
It was separated a little bit from where they're at, but then they'd all be getting together out at the Dry Lakes or some of these shows even to kind of work together. But yeah, he also commissioned a lot of vehicles.
He did. Well, he knew that
built,
he knew to run a successful shop, he had to have some type of flagship.
Yeah.
So he built a car. Well, he didn't build the car. That's where Bill Burke built the car.
Yeah.
So he builds the SoCal belly tanker, which at the time it was called a belly tanker. It wasn't a Lakester, because they're kind of now referred to as Lakesters.
Yeah. But even then in SCTA, they classified him as an A-class streamliner.
Right. Yeah. So, and that again, too, is probably like, what do I do with that? It's not a car. So it looks kind of like a streamliner. We'll make it that, right? But, that thing was based off, like you said, it was based off of a belly tank, drop tank, a Model T frame, and it had a flathead V8 in it. The first flathead V8 was just a Ford V8. It wasn't a hopped up one or anything like that. But the car, the first time out, it went like almost 90 miles an hour, which if you think about...
it's a go-kart, basically.
It's a go-kart.
That's sketchy.
Right. Yeah. I mean, you're in a gas tank on wheels.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, pretty much.
You are.
Right. But he got doing that, he got the attention of Bobby Meeks. Who now Bobby Meeks was Vic Edelbrock's kind of like
his best kept secret. Or not secret, but like his the guy,
his assassin.
Yeah, his guy.
Yeah. So Bobby Meeks runs into him. They kind of see what they're doing, and he's like, "Hey, let's see what we can do over here at Edelbrock's place." So they ended up setting up a Merc block, which a Merc block had a little bigger bore size, right? So he had larger cubic inches. You know, obviously Edelbrock tuned it, and they went out again, and the thing went like 137 miles an hour. Wow. So I mean, it was a large jump from the first time.
Just
out.
to show, how much you can increase the, basically the engine of it. I mean, because a lot of if you look, this is really when parts started to really become made, or certain combinations, because a lot of it before was getting rid of as much weight as possible, making it as aerodynamic as possible, and putting a bigger engine into it, maybe tuning it differently, but you didn't have maybe some of the parts that would actually help increase
exactly
it.
Well, and the thing that, once you mentioned parts, this helped both of their companies exponentially. I mean, to be the guy that drove a belly tank 137 miles an hour and set a Class A record, the first time basically out, that made Alex Xydias a player in the game. And of course, it being tuned by Edelbrock, that also made Edelbrock. Yeah,
it's a good combination where it's like, okay, this is the engineer behind it, this is the guy racing it and promoting it, and you can kind of combine it all together.
And we're talking like 48, 49 when this is happening?
That would have been, so 48.
Yeah, right? Okay.
But, and then, so kind of on the same tail end of that, the Streamliner that.
Well, that's Dean Batchelor.
So Dean Batchelor, was the first to actually letter on his car, the SoCal Speed Shop.
Like on the bottom cowl there. That's very iconic. Right. Yeah.
But he convinced him to build a Streamliner.
Right.
And
they were partners in it.
Yeah. And they actually, basically kind of took apart the belly tanker to kind of build the Streamliner.
Yeah. So I think what the deal was the Dean Batchelor convinced Alex to sell, or Dean sold his coupe.
Yeah.
It's
32. Yeah.
Right. Sold his coupe, or it was actually a Roadster. I'm sorry. So he sold his Deuce, had the money to pay for the body, but they had to have the chassis and the engine. Yeah. So that's what they dismantled.
Took apart the belly tanker.
And then
created the SoCal Streamliner.
Right. And that was kind of a hodgepodge of a couple different things, because a lot of people are, they credit obviously Valley Customs with Neil Emery and Clay Jensen. That's his name. Which those guys were brother-in-laws. And so they were already kind of a well-known, like even Alex Xydias had a 34 Cabriolet already. Like his street car was built by Valley Customs. Yeah. So they were kind of the known guys in the Valley, again, too, Burbank and that whole area, right? So those guys, they called them over, and
they worked mostly on the body stuff on it. Yeah.
And it was determined that they said, okay, we're going to do like an oval body because it's the easiest thing we can do. Because at the time, remember, land speed cars were these super long, like drawn out, huge cars.
Yeah.
And to them, they're like, look, we can make this smaller car.
They probably didn't have that big of a shop.
Well, not that, but also it was Neil, like you mentioned, it was Neil that was in the war that saw all of the Alfa Romeos and all of the smaller like MGs and stuff like that from Europe. And he said, why can't we make it smaller?
Yeah. And because like later on, that Emery family would be heavily involved in the Porsche industry and building cars and stuff. And that's the thing. So they hodgepodge some parts together from even other cars to kind of create that flagship. It first ran at El Mirage and ran 138. Yeah. Which, like I said, at this time, the Streamliners were going, the big guys, the British guys were going double that. Right. But for basically a small little garage built hot rod, that was, pretty decent, but it kept getting better from there.
Well, yeah, and it kept getting better into there to the point where it was even touted the fastest American built car. Yeah. Right.
And that's because that's the difference. At this time, the records were being held by the British guys. Right. But that's kind of here's the shifting, from kind of racing European to homegrown racing, in California, basically.
Well, and even that success, that helped Robert Peterson and Wally Parks to look at this and say, hey, guys, we need to race somewhere else than El Mirage and Muroc, because it being the dirt in the lakes, it was very you couldn't really test, or you couldn't even really see if the lake was going to be in good condition at all times. Yeah. Whereas this area called Bonneville, where some of these bigger guys were already going out and doing land speed records.
Yeah, they had already kind of graduated out of the dry lakes.
Right.
So these guys did too.
It was Wally and Robert that went to the Bonneville, whatever, the park ranger, and said, hey, can we start running on the course? And they said, of course, yes. And they were showing like things like, hey, the Streamliner's coming out. We're doing these things. We need to go to a faster and also a safer area. And they did. I mean, the Streamliner ended up going like 210 miles an hour at Bonneville. Yeah. So it was a huge jump for them to go out there and do that.
Yeah, and that's the thing too. When you have all these guys that can actually test and tune the motors, have the mechanical knowledge to do all that, being able to have a reliable, consistent passes to know, okay, if I do this, this will change it versus the unknown,
right?
Going out there.
Well, and even too, what it did for those guys was it put young American mechanics on the map, because even NASCAR, who was just getting started, I mean, you got to remember NASCAR was started in 1948. In 49, they invited Alex and Dean to come out and run the car at Daytona. And Daytona at the time was the Bonneville. That was like, if you went to Daytona Speed, that was a big deal.
Mecca, yeah.
Right. So, and it's kind of funny. There's a funny quote that Alex says that, because on that trip for them going out to Daytona, Robert Peterson was trying to get Hot Rod Magazine started at that time. So he gave him some money so they could put the name Hot Rod on the side of the car. And the hilarious thing about it is Alex says, his money ran out in Blythe, which is the last city of California.
Yeah,
right?
It is. So. Yeah, and it's about 4 hours from... Yeah, well, maybe a little longer back then, but yeah. Freeways and stuff weren't exactly going.
Yeah.
But no, and so maybe that's a good kind of little bit of a segue to talk about the birth of Hot Rod Magazine.
Absolutely.
We mentioned earlier, Wally Parks did not like the name or term Hot Rod, but within a year, he was embracing it. Robert Peterson was embracing it. All these guys were embracing that term. It's kind of like, hey, if you can't beat them, join them, and just take advantage of it. But then obviously they try to create some of the more safety aspects of it. So Robert Peterson, Peterson Publishing, obviously there's the Peterson Automotive Museum that we've recorded Car Guy Confessions at several times. He originally started working at MGM Studios. Like I say, he was a California guy. The next thing that he did, he worked for a Hollywood PR agency.
Okay.
And that PR agency was tasked by a organization to basically promote the LA Hot Rod Exhibition.
Okay.
So there was a show in 1948 that was called the Hot Rod Exhibition.
Right.
And it was held at the LA Armory.
Okay.
Makes sense. Hey,
that
all
the
military guys coming back. SCTA was a sponsor of the show. Multiple people were sponsors of it. Apparently there was some stuff that happened at the PR agency. Him and Bob Lindsay ended up leaving.
Okay.
And so what they did is they decided to basically print Hot Rod Magazine and sell it out on the steps of the entrance to the show. How cool. No, so I mean, this was, pretty key on the early years of showcasing the hot rod stuff.
Right.
This was 1948 through 1951 is when this show ran. And what was pretty cool too is it was like a full week show.
You're right.
Like it wasn't just a one day car show that we're used to.
Yeah.
They actually would fully customize like a 32 and give it away.
Oh, that's cool.
At the show.
Yeah. Where were you at? Overhauling, right?
No, that's what I'm saying. It's like, we think of a lot of things of like, oh yeah, we'll do a live build and give it away. And it's like, yeah, they did that at the very first car show.
Right.
So,
yeah, cool.
But that got a lot of people, and the guys that was in charge of building those cars during the show was Lou Baney.
Okay.
Who, was kind of one of the key guys as well, but not really talked about as much as, some of the other names that we've been mentioning.
Right.
But basically, Peterson and Bob Lindsay, they were basically hawking the, magazine out front. And then what they would do is they would give free, anyone who was an exhibitor inside, they'd give a free ad to.
Oh, smart.
And so I guess they made like 10,000 copies. And then and then the next issue was 50,000. And I mean, it just kept exploding from there. But that really helped to bring Southern California hot rod culture out to the rest of the country, because now you didn't have to just be at a show in LA or at a race in LA. You could get it in the mail, like a Sears catalog and check it all out. And you could then dial up, 33, Vic Edelbrock and order some parts.
Well, it's funny you mentioned that, because guys like Alex Xydias, the way he stayed open the first couple years was selling his catalog for 25 cents that he placed an ad in Hot Rod magazine that if you sent him a quarter, he'd send you a paper catalog with all of the stuff that he sold.
Yeah. So he was even at least making money on the catalog.
That's what kept his doors open, right?
Maybe not the parts yet.
Not the parts yet, but that's the catalog that kept him going, right? I mean, that's kind of like, how do I make $1 million? Send me $1. Do what I did.
Yeah, and get 1 million people to send you $1.
Right.
Yep. But that's, I mean, they really were capitalizing at the right time with this. Like we mentioned, all the shows. There was even, the first movies were coming out that were featuring teenage hot rodders,
right.
like causing havoc and trouble and racing and like, there was a movie called Speed, not Keanu Reeves.
Yeah, right.
That was a little bit hot rod oriented, but that was in the early 40s.
Right.
But then you had Devil on Wheels. You had actual Hot Rod, the movie in 1950.
Right.
A little bit later, the Wild One, and then all the...
Well, 54 is the Fast and Furious, too.
Yeah.
Which is a little bit... I know
the early Fast and Furious.
Yeah, right.
But yeah, so I mean, Hollywood was taking advantage of it because obviously it was in their backyard.
Well, and Hollywood guys were doing it. Like
and
I
Hollywood
mentioned,
guys were doing it.
Mickey Rooney had a roadster.
Yeah.
Like he would go out to the dry lake beds and run it.
And we just mentioned that Alex went to high school with
he went to high school with
them,
right? Guys like, this is later on. I mean, but Tommy Ivo, those kind of guys that they were on production movies or TV shows, but they were hot rodders. So yeah, that was the popular thing of the day.
Yeah. And also too, we've looked at, there's NASCAR, you said starting was, more back east, the Moonshiners, kind of that, but it was still basically circle track racing.
Oh yeah.
The dragster, the long straight stuff was really something that happened in Southern California.
Correct.
That were like modeling after the land speed stuff.
Right.
And some of those shows, like I said, the 51 was the last year of the LA, hot rod exhibition or exposition.
Yeah.
But kind of coming on the tail of that, the Oakland Roadster Show started popping up in 1950.
Right.
And Al Sloniker, now people hear the Sloniker Award.
Right.
That's from the founders.
Yeah.
But he had actually held just a general automotive show in 1949.
Right.
Saw how popular the hot rod section was.
Yeah.
And goes, okay, I'm just going to do a roadster show.
Right. Exactly.
And that's the thing. Still at this time, a lot of the roadsters that was the quintessential hot rod, but that did start to kind of change too at this time.
Well, let's bring this up because there was two brothers that actually kind of made everything except for one model very popular. Yeah. So coupes at the time at SCTA were not allowed to run.
They weren't allowed. They were in some of the other timing associations, like the Rosetta Timing Association. They allowed coupes to run, but unless you had a roadster or a streamliner,
that was it.
Couldn't run an SCTA.
Nope. So, and there's even a quote that Alex Xydias even says, we didn't think that coupes were hot rods.
Yeah.
I mean, he flat out said, we didn't think.
And there was even a quote too, I think it might have even been from Wally Parks, that saying like, there's nothing that's going to beat a roadster. It's
made to go fast.
That's what a roadster is made for.
Right. Yeah. And at the time, most people did that. I mean, we'll talk later about Vic Edelbrock's roadster, but I mean, at the time, that was kind of the unit you used. But the Pearson brothers, Bob and Dick Pearson, who actually Bob is the older brother, and he was the vice president of the Rosetta Timing Association. So they were already running prior to the war, they were running Bob's coupe, which was a 36 3-window coupe in their timing association, and ran well. I mean, it ran like almost 117 or something like that. So when they got back from the war, Bob was still working on his 3-window coupe, and younger brother Dick went over there and bought a 34 Ford coupe from a firefighter that was in Inglewood, the city that they grew up in. And I think he bought it for like $25.
Yeah.
So.
Well, I mean, and that's the thing at that time in the late 40s and early 30s car.
Yeah.
There was a lot that were sitting around and, new cars were kind of starting to come out at that point. So
people
were just getting rid of them.
Well, here's what people forget. So if it's 1946, they haven't made a car since 1944. Yeah. So people coming back from the war, they're like, I want to buy a new car. I don't want this old 30s car. That thing's 10 years old.
Or if you had that 10-year-old car, you needed to fix it
upgrade.
Up because it was 10 years old and you couldn't get, and maybe you couldn't afford something brand new.
Right. But that was the good thing and it's similar to what we're doing now is you bought an old car for cheap and you got a great power plant. You put the two together and you got something that's fun.
Modernize it, fix it up, clean it up and have fun with it.
And so the Pearson brothers did exactly that. They tore into that car and knowing the rules for the Resetta Timing Association, they actually cut and chopped the car. They chopped the car and they laid the windshield back as much as the rules would allow them. It wasn't the fact of, hey, this is the design.
This is what looks good.
No,
this
it was
is
like,
what the testing
right,
showed us
so
what works well. This is as far as we can go.
They tried to make it as small as they possibly can to cut that wind, right? And so they did. And
as much as a wedge as they could.
Exactly. And the funny thing, too, is Dick later on says, he goes, between me and my brother, it took 5 weeks for me to build a car and go 140 miles an hour, because that's exactly what they did. That car, the first time out, went 140 miles an hour. And I'm talking about the Pearson's, the 2D coupe, right, which is the red, white, and blue scallop car. That's
kind of pretty iconic.
Right. And the first time that it went out, it was primered. And, it was an unrecognizable car. But Alex Xydias had heard about their fame, if I guess you want to call it that, going that fast, quickly out there.
Well, and that was out at El Mirage, so I'm sure that even if it was, maybe because the SCTA was a little,
well, I was just going to say this. They were
classy, class.
Remember, they were the sports car guys.
They were,
and these guys were the rough and tough hot rod guys that were racing around.
So maybe they saw each other, but
they did
off in a distance. Yeah,
they did, and the theory got, or the word got out that they went 140 miles an hour, and most people didn't believe him because, again, too, Bob was the vice president of the Timing Association.
Yeah.
So it was Alex that said, "Hey, why don't you guys come over to the SCTA and do an exhibition, and let's really see," because they wanted to see if their clocks were hot. That was the idea.
Well, no, they wanted to see because then also too that could help bring more business and more members to SCTA if basically they would test that car and it wasn't going to run 140, and they could say, "Oh yeah, those guys are cheating."
Right. Now, the nice thing about it is when those guys showed up, they showed up in the car painted the way you see it now.
Yeah.
And
so they made a good statement.
They made a statement when they showed up. And the good thing about it, too, is the statement they made is they ran that car and it went 151 miles an hour on SCTA's timing, which was the second fastest run of the entire event. So
not only did a coupe beat what other people said it wouldn't do, it went even faster, and it beat all the roadsters.
Exactly.
Except for one.
Right.
I'm curious. Did we find out?
I don't know if we did. Yeah, I don't know. But the cool thing is that actually got, that put those guys on the map, because Robert Peterson, with all of this buzz about this car, he featured it in the May issue of the May 48 issue of Hot Rod, which is I think the second issue, right? Because
it was probably like the fourth or something, because it was the end of 47 is when that LA show was, and when they launched the very first issue of the magazine.
But by August, they had that car on the cover.
Yeah.
And that catapulted the Pearson brothers. And also, too, they also knew a guy named Bobby Meeks. This guy keeps coming up, right?
Well, and that's, so there's the network is forming of all of these guys, basically.
And Bobby Meeks told those guys, "We can make your car go faster. Come over to Edelbrock's garage." And they did. They brought over the car. They built a Merc-based block, and they built up a nice V8 60 is what those were called back then, because it was 60 horsepower from the factory.
Yeah.
And they put all the Edelbrock
60 horsepower from the factory.
Right? So they did all the hop-up stuff on it, and sure, they went out there, and that car created history. And even to this day, Bruce Meyer owns that car.
Yeah.
So it sits on Rodeo Drive basically in a museum.
Yeah, his private collection.
His private collection. That car is kind of the square one of what we're talking about.
Yeah, and because too, a lot of it, I think that seemed to be like a, like you said, like a fully top to bottom kind of built, where it was chopped, had a lot of this bodywork, but then it was fully painted.
Right.
And had the Edelbrock stamp on it from the tuning and the parts on it. So kind of, if whereas maybe some of the other ones, maybe they're iconic, but they kind of looked maybe just like your normal roadster,
right?
Or something like that. And there were several of those that are still pretty iconic, especially even Vic Edelbrock's.
Well, yeah, the Pearson brothers too. They ended up going on to work for Vic, because Vic was kind of the guy. Okay, he was older. He didn't go into the war. He actually was too old to enter the war. So what he did is he stayed back and he did a lot of machining. And all the aircraft companies were around that area that he was in. He was in like the mid-Wilshire area of LA. Well, you've got Lockheed, you've got, all of these other companies that are around that area that they need airplane parts. So he learned a lot of stuff too, a lot of machining techniques that he would have never even learned if it would have been automotive, because those were the contracts that said, "Oh, hey, I need you to machine magnesium. I need you to machine these like metals that you would never have worked with before." And also he learned how to
figure it out.
Well, he had to learn how to die cast. He had to learn how to do all of this stuff, which of course is going to help all of us out later on.
Yeah.
Right. So that was kind of Vic's big thing. But Vic also too, Bobby in 38, I think it was when Bobby showed up and convinced Vic to buy a Roadster.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously that's the classic black number 3.
Yeah.
And it was to test his parts, because he had been working with people before. Even he had worked with a couple guys on his slingshot manifold. But the idea is he didn't have a car to test it on. So that's when Bobby's like...
Yeah, something that they owned and they could run themselves versus just, okay, here, go out and see. Yeah.
Right. So he gets that Roadster, and sure enough, he pretty much perfects the slingshot manifold. And that being the case, it's a 180-degree manifold that would allow you to put not just one carburetor on, which was always what the factory had, but you can now put 2 carburetors on it.
Yeah.
And the 2 carburetors weren't just Ford carburetors. They were Strombergs off of an aircraft. So everything kind of made sense from what the war had taught everybody. Like, hey, this is the direction we're going.
Yeah.
The technology is, if right now, if we looked at it, it'd be like, hey, everyone's going the Tesla, direction. Well, for them, it was everyone's going the aircraft direction.
Yeah.
So it worked out for them. And then, of course, too, during the war or after the war, we go back to midgets. And that's where midgets were super popular at that time. And Vic was kind of the guy that people went to for that because he was the only guy that could fight the Offies. He took those V8 60 engines and he tuned them so well that he would be the only competition for the 4-cylinder Offies. Now, we've learned later on, and this isn't, this is kind of common knowledge now, but we've even learned from the horse's mouth herself, Cammy Edelbrock, that her grandfather was playing around with nitromethane at that time, and that's why those engines would go out there and beat the Offies, because they put a little bit...
they were juicing it.
Yeah, they called it pop, because it'd make the motor pop. And also, too, soda pop was a big thing back then.
Yeah, that was popular.
So they would tell them, like, oh, we just put a little bit of pop in it, and... now the thing makes, some power. However, there is the famous story where the first time they tried it, it was Vic Sr. and Bobby Meeks. And they, of course, they're thinking it's like alcohol because they were playing around with other fuels. They were playing with alcohol and even blending fuels back then.
Yeah.
So they went ahead and they put a little bit of nitromethane on the engine that was on the dyno, and they couldn't shut it off. Because remember, nitromethane doesn't need oxygen to run. So,
they're like, what do we do? Do we
right.
just sit here?
They tried to cover it. They even doused it with water. And it wouldn't shut off. Mm-hmm. So there's that.
So they were testing some stuff out.
Right? That was probably a scary time.
Oh, I'm sure you're like, is this gonna explode?
Yeah, right.
Is it just gonna keep going? Like, you don't know what's gonna happen, but they were taking the risk and trying something new.
Right.
Borrow a little of what you had learned in the war and throw it on there.
Yeah.
And so this is, bleeding into the early 50s, when then Wally Parks, who was an early editor of Hot Rod Magazine.
Correct.
Was very tied in with Peterson and all that. Mm-hmm. He was doing the safety safari because, like I said, he was trying to, now they owned the name Hot Rod, but he was trying to distance themselves from the, rough teenagers and the negative connotation. So the safety safari is kind of what.
Well, that gets mixed up because safety safari is more of Wally's NHRA thing, but they had a safety, and it wasn't called safety safari. I'm sorry. It was called something, but it was called safety something.
Yeah.
When it comes to me. But remember, Wally was also the chairman at the time of SETA when Robert Peterson started coming around. So for Robert Peterson being a PR guy, he wasn't a race car guy. Mm-hmm. He needed a Wally Parks.
Yeah.
He needed the guy that was in the know. So he went after the guy that's like, oh, hey, you're the president of SCTA. You write the newsletter. Okay. You're my guy.
Yeah.
So, but the cool thing about that collaboration is that Wally was a racer. Wally was like, we need better safety. We need a better place to run at. We need more speed parts. Like, he organized that thing. And Robert Peterson was smart enough to say, I have those people. I have people that are advertising in this publication.
Yeah.
So the two
can all kind of network it together.
Right.
And that kind of helped to lead to the National Hot Rod
exactly.
Association.
Right.
Not the National Sports Car Association.
Right.
But that was, NHRA and like the drag strip stuff. But you still had, obviously, even with that, the popularity of hot rodding exploded in the 50s.
Of course.
So you had, the rock and roll teenagers, you had, the grease lightning, the hot rod stuff, that really exploded in the 50s. And, so like the guys that started it were now doing drag racing.
Right.
But there were still the teenagers that were running the streets and
it's the
causing
same
havoc.
It's the same thing.
It's how it's always going to be.
Right. I was going to say the land speed gentleman racers from England.
Yeah.
Spawned the guys like the Alex Xydiases and the Vic Edelbrocks of the guys that learned a lot of stuff from the war that came back and were mechanically inclined, and they kind of laid out the blueprint for the younger kids.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? Because let's start talking about Ed Iskandarian. Because Ed is another pioneer, I'm going to say. And he was a farm boy. He was a farm boy from Tulare, California. Yeah. And farming dried up in the 30s, so he moved to L.A. and went to a polytechnical high school. He went to L.A. Poly. And that's a working high school. It's not a, yes, you learn history, but you also learn how to machine.
Yeah.
Right. So him and his buddy, John Ashton, which these are two guys that they're so close to me because I used to have a shop in Gardena and I would have lunch with these guys and Nick Arias like almost every day. And these guys would tell me old stories about John Ashton's the first guy that ever put a 29 Roadster body on a set of 32 rails. Right. Which is by far the most popular combination of land speed or even the hot rods back then.
No, for sure.
And I mean John Ashton's the guy that built like the Elvis Presley Roadster that was in Love Me Tender, or one of those Elvis
one of the
movies.
Elvis movies. Yeah.
But the Elvis Roadster, that was John Ashton's. So the two of those guys, they got together, and after the war, Isky even bought a building on Washington Boulevard in Culver City that was right behind Mercury Machining where John Ashton worked. So the two of those guys, John was like bringing over like, hey, look, this is the latest valve grinding machine. Let's mess with it. And Isky, of course, like, oh yeah, of course, right? And so
all into the technology,
right? And so they built Isky's Roadster, which is that combination. It's that 29 body on a 32 set of rails, but it's got a Ford flathead in it with overhead valve heads. So I mean, that right there alone, that was like, we're talking like a Lamborghini motor putting into a Tesla right now. I mean, that was like blew people's minds.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, kind of unheard of for the time.
And, then again, they were they were also those guys, like they had technology, they knew the smarts, but they didn't want to try to like reinvent the wheel. But the problem was that guys weren't making parts fast enough. And that's where the two of those guys were like, well, hey, we need a different cam profile. Well, let's just grind our own. And they started grinding their own camshafts. And of course, then word got around because where they're at in Culver City with the rest of all of those stadiums and all that racing that was around there, people got word, oh, hey, these guys are over there grinding cams. And of course, Robert Peterson got word of that, visited Isky and said, well, why don't you guys sign up with my new magazine? And Isky believed in that. I mean, he full-heartedly, if you look at Isky's career, he's always been into advertising and always very unique advertising. There's always like the Cam Father, like all these little he's branding things that he's done forever.
Kind of ahead of it. And, yeah.
So that's what really kind of jump-started his career too, is because more people, again, they found out about it. The guys that were in Iowa or the guys that were in, Wisconsin, they're all of a sudden like, I can get a cam ground for my flathead? Like, what the hell? Yeah. Right? And that was a big deal for them. So that was kind of Isky's way of doing it. And Isky, of course, goes on to, we couldn't have what we have now without Isky.
Yeah. I mean, that's one of the founding members of SEMA.
Exactly.
I think there's the first president.
He's the first president of SEMA. Yeah. Yeah. But I mean, not only that, I mean, he's the first guy to hard face a camshaft. So in other words, he's the first guy to treat a camshaft well enough so it won't eat itself. Yeah. He's also the first guy like that made hydraulic lifters work with a camshaft or a performance camshaft. So, he used computers in the 60s and 70s to figure out cam designs when people were still using slide rulers. I mean, this guy is like way ahead of his time. Yeah. But also, he's the guy that'll sit down with you and talk about flying airplanes around, the South Pacific and giving soldiers roast beef sandwiches. He's also the guy that will go to like, he'll go to these big, huge clearinghouse things for surplus and he'll buy everything in the place and put it in some back, building.
Lot. And
right. Because he's a tinker.
Well, and we'll pop up some pictures of his office as well.
Oh,
it's
my God.
Just full to the brim of everything. But that's also a little bit of that generation of the Depression era to then World War II and rationing, and they hung on to it.
Yeah, they would keep things because they never knew
fix it up, right? And upgrade it or change it.
Yeah.
And you mentioned a little bit about some of the younger guys, because obviously a lot of these guys that maybe you had a generation, but there's always some fringe stuff, like you mentioned, Edelbrock being a little older.
Yeah.
You had guys that like Gene Winfield that recently just passed away, who was a younger guy. Yeah. He didn't get into the Army until after the war, like at the very end of the war, if not after, because he was 12 years old or something when it all started.
Right.
But he was at 15 years old. He was buying a hot rod. Like he was working and customizing it.
Yeah.
In 1942. So he was 15 years old in 1942, like I said, when the war basically was starting.
Yeah.
And he had a Model A coupe. Then he got a Roadster, street raced that. And he definitely went down the very customizing route.
Well, that's his neighborhood.
That's his neighborhood. You know, and then a lot of the guys, there was a lot that went to the drag racing side. So there's kind of, at this point, there's a big, especially with the show circuit of the Oakland Roadster Show,
right?
Detroit Autorama all starting up. There's a little bit of a split in the mid 50s where there's guys taking some newer cars and doing the full customizing to it,
right,
that was inspired by the hot rods. And then you had guys that were sticking with hot rods or maybe going full Drakes. I was saying dry lake dragsters.
Well, there's a Drake chassis, so you weren't far.
All right. Well, there you go. Maybe I'll have to pop up a picture of that because I have no clue what that is. But there was kind of a definite, a little bit of a splitting of going down the drag racing side and the hot rod side, still on the street with, like you said, with all the kids,
right,
and like the custom side of it. So I think for this, we're still going to keep going down the hot rod angle.
Yeah.
But then after that, we're going to get into the birth of custom cars, birth of lowriders, because that was kind of tied in as well.
Correct.
And that really is just the foundation of all custom automotive.
Absolutely.
But basically, this was kind of the true nitty gritty of the hot rod era and how it got started. So from here, we're kind of branching off a little bit, but we'll stick with hot rods.
Loving it.